Hello and welcome to part 3 of my study into sex, sexuality and gender in the Old Testament. I invite you to have a look at the earlier videos in this series if you haven't already had a chance to do so. Otherwise we'll crack on with part 3, which is called All the Girls and Boys. This should be quite a short one today. We'll look first at Na'ar and Na'ara. Na'ar is the Hebrew word for boy and Na'ara is the Hebrew word for girl. And you may begin to be familiar with the idea that the R ending turns a male noun into a female one. And so likewise, Na'arim with the im ending means boys plural, and Na'arot with the ot ending means girls plural. Just like their English equivalents, these words can refer to the very young right up to young adults, or even adults who are not yet in a permanent relationship. Na'ar and Na'ara can also refer to a servant or someone of a lower class. And it's perhaps a little unfashionable these days to speak of subordinates in English as boy or girl, but in our not-so-distant past it was not uncommon, particularly to use the word girl to refer to a young adult woman in a subordinate role, and even more so when class divide was involved. Now we still retain a far more enshrined appropriation of an English word meaning young girl or virgin to mean a servant in our language. And that word is maid. We'll look at that in a minute, but first let's look at a curious ambiguity that crops up with girls and boys in Genesis. And it's one that's not fully corrected until we get to Judges. Na'ar in Genesis is the same as it is elsewhere in the Bible, but Na'ara is missing the equivalent to an H at the end. Na'ara without the H also occurs 13 times in Deuteronomy, but it's been corrected in the margins by later scribes. It's unclear why this was done for Deuteronomy and not for Genesis. However, it is noticeable that one occurrence of Na'ara with the H at the end appears in Deuteronomy 22 verse 19. This spelling variation isn't a major issue in itself. After all, language changes over time. But when we take into account the fact that for many centuries these words would not have had any written vowels, it's then noticeable that during that time, in written form, a young girl and a young boy in Genesis would have appeared visually as the same word. Should we assume that those who shared the scriptures verbally from one generation to the next recalled and accurately transmitted the intended sense of gender in the text? Or was there originally no difference intended until these young Na'ars were old enough to have a sexual identity? Perhaps we shouldn't read too much into this because Genesis still has mentions of Na'arot girls and Na'arim boys. Though there is only one use of Na'arot in Genesis, and it's in a construct form with a third-person feminine singular possessive suffix, and you don't need to know what that means. But in this context, in the context of this particular verse, the word is usually translated as something like her maids or her attendants, and not girls. And so we don't have a clear translation of plural female girls in Genesis. Anyway, this brings us from girls to maids and maidens and the question of virginity. The word batola, the word for virgin, like our English word maiden, can literally and specifically refer to a virgin, or it can more generally refer to a young woman who might be ready to be joined to a man. It's notable that perhaps the Hebrew language, or specifically the text of the Bible, displays no interest in talking about the virginity of men. Read what you will into that. Another word, olel or olal, is specifically used to describe a child who is young enough to be nursing at their mother's breast. There are several variations of this word throughout the Old Testament, and it is based on the root verb ul, to suckle or to give milk. It's perhaps worth noting that the verb is always used in a feminine form, but the noun is always used in a male form. So the child here has no defined gender in the same way that in English neither infant or child have gender. In part 1, we looked at zakah and nekeva and how these words refer to, in quite biological ways, to the male and female genders. of both humans and animals. It's worth noting, having talked about Na'ar and Na'ara, that Zakar and Nekeva in some contexts can also refer to children. Leviticus 12 verse 7 says, "He shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement on her behalf. Then she shall be clean from her flow of blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, male or female." In this verse, Zakar and Nekeva are used directly in the context of a woman giving birth to a male or female child. Yet there is no olel or equivalent in this verse. The NRSV overcomes this problem by adding the word child, whereas the NIV chooses to translate Zakar and Nekeva as boy and girl in this context. I think it would feel rather odd in English to talk about a woman giving birth to a male or female without adding some sort of noun to those adjectives. Yet this is how the sentence is constructed in the Hebrew. Now, firstly, I think this shows that unlike Ish and Ishah, there is no age or life status restriction on Zakar and Nekeva. But perhaps more significantly, it shows them as being acceptable terms for human offspring. Now, given that this usage is found in the pages of Leviticus, I think it's not unreasonable to ask ourselves how this might further affect our reading of Zakar in the context of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. Imagine reverse engineering that interpretation of the word back into Leviticus 18:22 or 20:13, where we talk about a man lying with a zakar. If that is male child or offspring, that again puts a very different tilt on these words. That's it for today. I hope you found something interesting in today's session. Next time we will be looking at part 4, Uncovering the Nakedness. I should clarify, though, there will be no actual nakedness in the video, but I look forward to sharing that part with you. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed this and other videos, please subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and press the little bell button that sends you notifications of when new videos are coming. See you soon. Goodbye.